Welcome, and tonight we're going to be off on a grand adventure into the past. We're going to be studying what I call the 12 disciples of the English Bible. And you'll notice that there are names up here, but there are 15 pictures. And so I want to point out to everybody that the ones in red are men who were very influential, and they were not necessarily good men, but what they did was a cause for good for developing the English Bible. And we'll go through those stories as we get to them. Mehmed II, King Henry VIII, and the Pope. So we'll be talking about them when we get to those, but we're going to start out with an introduction, and then we will go to the first person, the Venerable Bede. So some of you all have heard much of this before when we went through the history of the Bible, and that was last spring, but I think it behooves us to get a little bit of an introduction to kind of get us up to speed to where the Bible was actually being translated into English and see God's plan. So as we're beginning our introduction, we always want to ask the question, why? Why would we do something like this? Would we venture into history and try and figure these things out? Well, God has had a plan, and His plan is for His church to make more disciples, make more people who will be in His family forever, for eternity. And so we want to study it because of provenance. That's a good old French English word, which means source of origin. We want to go back and see what the origins were, what history tells us that many of us have never learned, and some of us who have learned have forgotten. And so this will be a survey. Now, what I want to point out is when we do a survey, we don't learn everything that is to know. That is a 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 10-year seminary course to learn everything that you need to know about the Bible and all of its languages and all of its translations and all of its commentaries. We're going to do a quick survey. So we understand from our history of the Jews that the Hebrews were very meticulous when they wrote anything down and saved it as the Word of God. Meticulous means extreme care about minute details because it was God's Word. That's why they were so meticulous. And then as time went on and the Greeks came to power over the Jews and over most of the world, they brought in the Greek language, and the Greeks were very meticulous as well. As a matter of fact, as you can see from this picture that was on the wall of a very wealthy person's house, even some women got into that profession of translating and keeping and reading to other women. And priests were always, and scribes were always bending over their tables, being very meticulous to get all of God's Word correct. And then as time came on, and it came on into the 800s, 900s, thousands, and on, as people who were men and women of God were working to make sure that in the language of the people, God's Word was able to go forth, and people would be able to learn the stories of the Jews in the Old Testament and learn the stories of Christ and the church in the New Testament. So, what have you been taught about how and when Christianity got to our forefathers in the British Isles? As most of us have come from either the British Isles or from the continent that was more northern Europe. And that is mainly what we want to study. There were a lot of artifacts, documents, manuscripts that were in Spanish and that were in Italian and that were in Latin and other languages, Arabic, but that's not most of our heritage. So we're going to just kind of survey our heritage. So if you haven't been taught it, you won't know it. But let's start with geography a little bit. What this red line represents is back in the days where the New Testament began, certainly, if there was good weather and fair wind, it took 4 weeks to reach Britannia. And we seem to think that back in the first century, everybody shuffled along in the dust and nobody could get anywhere very fast. And that was true in many cases, but if you had a good ship with good sails and a good crew, you could get all the way to Britannia and back in a couple of months. And trade was already going very well in the first century. The Romans had taken over the world and they were making Roman roads everywhere, but their main mode of transportation was the sea, the Mediterranean, and then also some of the major rivers. And so we're going to talk about Judea over here and North Africa, and then of course Italy and Asia, but then we're going to talk about Spain and Britannia here. Now, why is it that we're going to talk about that? Well, it's important to realize why the Romans wanted Britannia. Why would the Romans, with all of this land and all of these people down in the Mediterranean area, why would they want to sail all the way to England for anything? Well, we learn that during the Roman period, massive gold veins exploitation took part in the Mendips and the Doakalthai. And those are two little areas in southwestern England. Right where this purple area is, in Wales and southern England, they found massive gold deposits and massive copper deposits and massive tin deposits in these mountains, more than any other place in Europe where you could get ships to for quick movement to the smelters for those. Now, of course, we understand that gold was a big deal from ancient Egypt times, right? And copper became very valuable to make copper pots, and that would withstand heat and would cook vessels well, things in vessels very well. And tin was mainly used for the Roman soldiers' armor. Tin was lighter than any other metal, but it was strong. And so they would smelt tin down and then fashion it into helmets and into breastplates and shin guards and all of those things that would protect their Roman soldiers and shields. And so the Romans found very quickly that there were massive tin deposits in what we know as Portugal today, and very great wealth in this area of Britain. So that's why the Romans, people wonder, why in the world would the Romans go up there and mess around with the British and do all of that? Well, follow the money. That's why they did it. And so there was regular commerce between Rome and Britannia in the first century and ongoing. In mid Wales, copper was the reason. Britain has significant sources of tin, and also Iberian tin, which is this tin we just talked about, was widely traded across the Mediterranean during the Bronze Age and extensively exploited during Roman times. So, now, who was the first person who brought Christianity to the British Isles that we have the record of? Joseph of Arimathea was a merchant of mines, a decurion for the Roman Empire, as well as a member of the Sanhedrin. And so, Joseph of Arimathea, do you know what a decurion is? Decuria is the number 10 in Latin, and it means 10. And so there were 10 men, usually, in every province of the Roman Empire that were in charge. It was like our administration folks in a city today. You know, you would have the person in charge of the roads, the person in charge of the aqueducts for water, the person in charge of all these different things. Well, every province that was along any coast had a Roman decurion of mines so that they could get all of that gold, copper, tin, etc. And so this is what Joseph of Arimathea was. He was a decurion. He was accepted, even though he was a Jew, into the Roman government, and he was decurion of mines for Judea. And he regularly had his people going from Judea up in ships to Britannia, to Iberia, and getting those raw metals, the ore, that would come back. And in Spain and in Italy and in Asia, there were smelters that would smelt that ore, and craftsmen that would fashion it into things that the Roman armies and the Roman people needed and wanted. And so this was being done, and we have record that Joseph of Arimathea, yes, that's who you know, the Bible's Joseph of Arimathea, was in Britain. Joseph believed in Jesus, buried Jesus, and probably witnessed his resurrection and ascendance along with the 500 witnesses. So we have those events that happened in the Bible, but we don't specifically have Joseph mentioned, except twice in the Bible he is mentioned for the burial of Jesus and giving his tomb. It took a pretty wealthy man to have a brand new tomb in Judea in that time of the world. And Joseph is mentioned by the gospel writers as that person. Well, what happened after he buried Jesus and everybody sort of went on their way except for that fledgling church that was begun by the apostles in Jerusalem? Well, it's interesting when we go to both Iona and Glastonbury, which is there in in southern Scotland, northern England, we have these little hints that we can pick out to kind of get us along our way. They began calling, and still call, the Lord's house Kuriakon Doma. Kuriakon Doma. And what this is, the English word for church is of Greco, Kuriakon, Scottish, Doma, heritage, brought into the Greek New Testament as the adjective Kuriakon, shortened to kirk, and came to mean in Scottish the gathering of the Christian clan. So today in Scotland, when you go over there, they'll say, what do you do on Sunday? Oh, we go to kirk. And that is where we get our word church. And that's a Greek word, not a Scottish word. According to Glastonbury chroniclers, reported by ancient Lord of Teignmouth, and quoted in Hearne's Antiquities of Glastonbury, there was a gravestone for Joseph of Arimathea in Avalon in the year 67 AD, which read in Old Latin, Cele Dei, which means friend of God in Chaldee, or Chaldee is what it's come to come to be pronounced as now, and dokoi kuevi, which means I taught and I have entered my rest. And they for centuries have believed that Joseph of Arimathea was buried in AD 67 after many years in England, was buried there. So let's kind of unpack that just a little bit. This is in Glastonbury Abbey ruins that were built around the 3rd century, which is the 200s AD. Pretty fairly, in terms of history, close to Christ and his ministry. And so we have these people walk through these. I don't know if any of you all have been over there to walk through these ruins today. They've got a museum and all that are there. And so what we know about Glastonbury Abbey ruins is it is still named as the mother church of the British Isles. It was the first church that was a big church by the 200s that was actually built as a church. Before that, they met in the great halls of the castles of the Christian kings. They met in groves underneath trees. They met in wherever they could meet according to how big the group became. So in 37, which is the year we believe that Joseph of Arimathea actually came to England to settle for good and not go back to the Israel area. He settles. He was referred to as Kelly Day, as I said, friend of God. In the year 37 was a very pivotal year for Christianity because Caligula came to power and he put out an edict against the Christians in AD 37. What you'll find in the history books is that as he came to power, he was such an evil person and was such a vile, lustful person that almost everybody hated him. And so somebody tried to poison him. He almost died. But then in AD 36, he recovered. And when he recovered, he was mad at everybody. He was thinking that everybody from his brothers and sisters to his generals to anybody, he didn't know who tried to poison him, but somebody was out to get him. And he started lopping off heads and exiling people. And finally, the people that were there, the senators and all said, you know, it's not us, it's not us, it's those Christians that are coming on. It's those Jews and Christians, and they're coming on, and what they've done is, because they were a small minority, they could blame it on them and get away with it, and Caligula believed them. So he put a decree against them and saying that nobody could hold an office in his court or in his empire if they were a Christian. Well, Joseph of Arimathea was a Christian. He automatically lost his home, his job, and his position with the Roman government. And so he took his ships and he went as a Christian up to England, and he had that as his base for trade, and he traded in England, Ireland, Sweden, Northern Europe, all the way down as far as Spain with all that he knew and all of his ships, and that was his new place of business. Then 42 AD, the chroniclers tell us that he brought Simon Zelotes by ship to Britain. You know Simon Zelotes, one of the 12 apostles that came up as far as France, and he sent, Joseph of Arimathea sent over to the continent to say, please Joseph, would you come and bring some people, because we have a fledgling church here that we need to get going. And so he came in 42, the chroniclers tell us, and then in 57 AD, he sends to this apostle Philip for brethren to help build churches and spread the gospel. In 58 AD, Philip then sends 12 disciples to Britain with Joseph, calling, in the chronicler's words, his dear friend, as the leader of that church. So we have all these mentions in different chronicles and in different lists of what the early people did and the early Christians did. And this is what we found. And so this is very wordy, but I just want to point out several things to you. These are proof texts pointing to early Britain Christian history. And in the old days, the Brits were called Britons. And so Tertullian, in AD 155 to 222, he was writing about the year 200, wrote in Adversus Judaeus that Britain had already received and accepted the gospel in his lifetime, writing, all the limits of the Spains and the diverse nations of the Gauls and the haunts of the Britons, inaccessible to the Romans, but subjugated to Christ. Hippolytus, same time period, considered to have been one of the most learned Christian historians, puts names to the 70 disciples whom Jesus sent forth in Luke 10, and includes Aristobulus, mentioned in Romans 16:10, with Joseph, and states that he ended up becoming a pastor in Britain. Eusebius of Caesarea, a little bit later on from those gentlemen, one of the earliest and most comprehensive of church historians, wrote of Christ's disciples in Demonstratio Evangelical, saying that some have crossed the ocean and reached the Isles of Britain. And finally, St. Hilary of Poitiers said, the next generation, that the apostles had built churches and the gospel had passed into Britain. All of this is documented. Finally, in about 800 AD, we have Nicephorus, the Patriarch of Constantinople, wrote, Simon, born in Cana of Galilee, who was surnamed Zelotes, having received the Holy Ghost from above, traveled through Egypt and Africa and Mauritania and Libya, preaching the gospel, and the same doctrine he taught to the Occidental Sea and the isles called Britannia. And so you can see this progression of Simon, born Zelotes, or becoming Zelotes. And if you have read my little book, The Killing the Bible, it's the first, if you were able to get through the first 2 chapters, you'll find much more documentation here than we've just been able to survey. But that should be enough to give us a start. And of course, we don't sell these. This is not a commercial. We give these away. So anybody is welcome to get a copy at any time to get more on those topics. So let's look at the next leap of the growth of Christianity in Britain. We've already talked about AD 37 to 67. These are approximate dates. It was so far back and so far on the edge of the kingdom that these folks came, and we've already made a case in another one of our books about the fact that the Apostle Paul probably came and spent a year in Great Britain. And you'll have to get the book. So, in AD 40, Bran the Blessed rules and becomes a Christian. He was a Christian, became a Christian after he was king by hearing from the apostles. And then in AD 60s, Prince Caractacus succeeds Bran. About AD 100, Prince Silenius succeeds Caractacus. Now all of these are Christian kings. Britain was the first Christian nation, not Italy, not Antioch or southern Asia Minor, but Britain was the first country that was a royal Christian nation. And of course, back in those days, if the king, whatever the king worshipped, you worshipped, or you were in outs with the king. So this became a very secure Christian nation. Prince Coel succeeds Silenius, and then Lucius succeeds. I've got a mistype in there, should be Coel there. And then Cadvan succeeds Lucius. Coel succeeds Cadvan in 210. And this is the Coel that they wrote the limerick about that became our sort of our Christmas song, Old King Cole. And he was Old King Cole because he had a son that was like Junior, Coelus. And he succeeds Coel. And so then in 282, finally, Constantius succeeds Coel. Now these last ones that are with the double asterisk, they weren't of the seed of Bran, but they married the daughters of these kings, and so they kept in the Christian faith. And after all, once you'd gone through all of these, it was over 100 years that the kingdom had been Christian. And so it was a natural thing for them to be Christians. These weren't wild men with paint on their faces running around in loincloths. They were sophisticated people who were craftsmen and artisans and merchants, as well as being in the agricultural business. And so Constantius was one of the 4 Caesars that were ruling during that time, the late 280s, in the Roman Empire. They had 4 Caesars, and Constantius was a Roman who had been elevated to Caesar because he was such a great general and put in charge of northern France and all of Britain. And so he married Helena, and then they birthed the future Emperor Constantine, who was the emperor in 306. So we can see how from the very beginning of these people that we talked about, we're come down to this Christian kingdom. Now let's talk about a little bit more of a person that we've heard something about in our history books that gives us more of a hint to that. You've heard of St. Patrick. We have St. Patrick's Day that we still celebrate in America. Well, St. Patrick was not an Irishman, he was a Brit. He was from Wales, or the northern part of Wales, which is right down here on the edge of this royal Christian northern Britain. Well, he wrote a lot of words, homilies, histories that we can grab onto that we still have to this very day. And he lived in 389 to 461 AD. But when he lived during this time period, about 425, he wrote the history of his family. And he wrote back and said, "My father, Calpurn, was a decurio and a priest." Well, we've kind of talked about that. You can get the picture. Then his father was a man named Potitus in about 300 AD, who was a presbyteri and a decurio of this northern kingdom of England. And his father before him was a diaconum, a deacon. In 250 AD, his name was Otis. And so Patrick gives us all of this history. And they have it in the museums in Britain to this very day. And there's, interestingly enough, St. Patrick, you know, our Catholic brothers and sisters mostly are the ones that are putting forth St. Patrick as an Irishman. But there's no mention of the Romish veneration of Mary. There's no mention of Eucharist only through a priest. There's no mention of veneration of holy relics or prayers to saints, which were all prominent in Rome. But St. Patrick, way back in those days, who had a history of Christianity in his family, in all of his writings, doesn't mention any of those things. They didn't exist. They only existed under the popes and the magistrates, the magistrum in Italy. Interesting that we have this. And of course, for most of the history that I put forth, I have my sources. So we have a record of the 3 Christian bishops who attended the Council of Arles in AD 314, called by Emperor Constantine. They supplied a list of the Diocletian persecution of the British Church. Diocletian reigned about 286 AD and ruled over the great persecution in 303 AD. This list had senior bishops on it and stated that over 10,000 Christians were in Britain and were persecuted. So by 314, when Constantine, the son of Constantius and Helena, who was a Brit, came to the throne, which is a wonderful, exciting, swashbuckling type story all on its own. By the time he came in and called the Council of Arles to get all what was called the bishops of the church together, and they all came in, he sponsored 3 British bishops to come. He sent a ship for them, and they came, and they were a part of that council. And they provided a list to him of all of the history and what had happened in the last 100 years under Roman rule. And of course, he knew a lot of what had happened because he was there helping his father, Constantius, before he died, and then he was made emperor. So, we have a record of the retirement of Christian bishops Theon and Tediac, retiring from their sees in London and York in 586 AD in protest of the Roman Church taking over the British Church. And so you can see, if you have these retirement of these old bishops, you had to have a church back there in the 300s and 400s. As a matter of fact, we have historian Gildas, who lived in AD 482 to 550, and he was the a very great Scottish historian. In his book, I'll let you read, Gildas mentions that the year of his birth was the same year as the Battle of Mons Badonicus in 482, which temporarily saved the islands for Christianity from the Saxons. And he's often pictured holding a Celtic bell of Scottish authority. He was the foremost, he was the Billy Graham of Scotland back in that century. And his rhetorical writing style indicates a classical Greco-Latin education. He mentions that Christianity was accepted long ago in Britain. As a matter of fact, there are over 100 copies that are still extant in the libraries of Britain of this that he wrote. He was so popular, and it was so popular, it was the first history of the Christian church in all of the British Isles. But he wrote that the current priesthood in Britain were corrupt as opposed to the true Christians in Scotland. And he actually is quoted in this as saying, Britain has Roman priests, but they are fools. Numerous ministers, but they are shameless. Clerics and bishops, but they are wily plunderers. So there you go. That's not me. That's Gildas who has written it, and it's been kept. Now, lastly, as we finish tonight our introduction and get ourselves up to the point where actual writing and translating is going to take place, we've got to mention the documents. And this is a picture of a page from the Gospel of John from the Eternac Gospels. And right now it's in Paris in the Bibliothèque Nationale. And it's the whole Gospel of John. And it's in Latin, and this is the cover page, and it's got the eagle on it. And this became a trademark of the artists in Britain. This manuscript and other such Hiberno-Saxon codices were highly important instructional devices used in the early Middle Ages primarily for conversion. What would happen is a disciple or a bishop or a priest would actually read the Gospel of John, would read the story like you'd read a storybook to children, and read all the way through it and say, now don't you want to believe in this Jesus? And people would be converted. The Eternac Gospels were probably taken by Willibrord, a Northumbrian missionary, to his newly found Abbey of Eternac, now in Luxembourg, from which they are named. So if you get the picture, Willibrord was a minister, priest, leader, presbyter in England. He had grown up. His whole family was there. But he was a missionary to Luxembourg, to the continent. And he decided he was going to take this copy that we have remaining of the Gospel of John and take it over to the continent and take this beautiful kind of work that was not known on the continent. They just did words. The scribes and the priests all did just words. But the people of Britain, having such a long history to already know the stories, started putting pictures to all the stories. And that helped people to understand because they could picture. It was sort of like they would say, okay, just picture this in your minds. The majestic king of birds, the eagle, flies high and has keen insight. And so, Christ the King, like that eagle, sees and knows and is majestic. He's our king. And they would get it in their brains because of the kind of pictorial way that they would bring the stories to life. The Scriptoria at Eternac became the most influential center for Hibernia Saxon style manuscript production in the continental Europe. So what it means is missionaries from the strong multi-century church in Britain were going over by the 600s and 700s, setting up abbeys, building them for monks to come, taking the artwork that was from the British artisans and making it something that went all over. You find that after the 600s and 700s, you have this kind of Hibernia Saxon artwork that shows up in Sweden in the Christian churches. Never had been there before. Shows up in Denmark. Shows up in the Low Countries of Europe and in France. And so by that, we're saying that British Christians with several hundred years of Christianity in their past were sending missionaries. Everybody has the idea that the popes and the Christians of Europe from the Mediterranean area sent all the missionaries, and finally they got to Britain in 586 when the Pope sent missionaries to Britain. Wrong. There was already a church there by hundreds of years that didn't quite like all the things that they were hearing from Italy. And this is just a copy of the Durham Gospels, late 7th century, that's the late 600s, kept in the Durham Cathedral Library. The book was produced at Lindisfarne and brought to Durham when the monks of Lindisfarne removed to Durham because of Viking attacks. And of course the Vikings, starting in the 700s right through the 900s, were a horrible scourge on England. The Durham Gospels were written by the same scribe that wrote the Eternac Gospels. And once again, you've got these great pictures on the facing pages and within the manuscripts. And so next week, we're going to actually start on a first person of our 12 disciples of the English Bible. And that's the Venerable Bede. You don't pronounce that last E. And he lived from 672 to 735. So now we're going to be able to get to a point where they were actually translating the Latin scriptures and the Greek scriptures, or from the Greek and from the Hebrew, the Latin and the Greek were going to be taken by Bede and translated into Anglo-Saxon early English. And we'll study that next week. His biggest claim to fame was he translated the Gospel of John from the ancient Latin to Anglo-Saxon so all of the people in Britain could read about Jesus Christ. And so that'll be next week's little topic of discussion, and then we'll go from there.